Introduction. The wind carries secrets across the red earth of South Australia's outback, where isolation becomes a language all its own. Here, beneath skies so vast they swallow whole lifetimes, silence isn't empty. It's full of memories, of choices, of the kind of solitude that either breaks you or forges you into something unbreakable. Some say the outback takes everything from you. Others whisper it gives back what you never knew you'd lost. For 19 winters, Amelie Crawford had believed the first. At 53, she'd grown comfortable with the rhythm of her own breathing, the creak of weathered timber, the way morning light painted her small station house in shades of amber and regret. Her sons, grown men now with city lives and busy hearts, visited when guilt or holidays demanded. But mostly, it was just Amelie and the endless red horizon, where the closest neighbor lived 40 kilometers away and loneliness had become as familiar as her own reflection. She'd buried her husband young, buried her dreams of growing old together even younger. What remained was this: a woman who could birth a calf in a storm, fix a windmill with wire and determination, and make a cup of bush tea strong enough to wake the dead. The outback had taught her to be sufficient unto herself. She wore her solitude like armor. But armor, even the finest kind, sometimes cracks. It was the middle of June, winter's cruel grip tightening around the station like a fist, when a stranger appeared on her doorstep. Not a drifter or lost tourist, but a man with steady eyes and callous hands, asking a question that would unravel 19 years of carefully constructed isolation. Will you let me build a fire here? 5 simple words that would change everything. Before we dive into the story of unexpected love, resilience, and second chances, I want you to know you're not alone in whatever season you're walking through. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from. I love connecting with souls from around the world who believe that it's never too late for a new chapter. Now, let me tell you about the winter that taught 2 hearts to beat as one. Chapter 1. 2 solitudes, 1 fire. The knock came at dusk, when the sky bled crimson across the endless expanse and the temperature began its nightly plunge toward freezing. Amelie looked up from her evening cup of tea, the steam curling between her fingers like prayers she'd stopped saying years ago. Visitors were rare enough to be events. In winter, there were practically miracles. She opened the door to find a man standing in the amber light of a porch, tall and weathered like the ghost gums that dotted her property. He was perhaps her age, maybe a touch younger, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes the color of old copper. Dust clung to his clothes, and she could see the outline of a pack on his shoulders, a swag rolled tight beneath it. "Evening," he said, voice rough as sandpaper but warm. "Name's Thomaz. Thomaz Kellner." The accent carried traces of somewhere else, European, maybe, though softened by years under the Australian sun. "I was hoping you might let me camp nearby for the night. Been walking since dawn, and the cold's got teeth tonight." Amelie studied him through the screen door, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind, the way his hands hung easy at his sides, not threatening, just tired. She'd lived alone long enough to read men like weather patterns. This one felt like clear skies, though storm could blow in without warning. "Walking from where?" she asked, not moving to unlatch the screen. "The old copper mine, 20 kilometers east. Been working there the past 8 months." He shifted his weight slightly, and she caught the flash of something metallic at his throat, a pendant or chain. "Mine's closing down. Crew shipped out yesterday, but I wanted to see more of the country before heading back to, well, wherever it is men like me head to next." There was something in the way he said it that made her chest tighten. The familiar ache of being untethered, of belonging nowhere in particular. She'd felt it herself after Robert died, that sense of floating in space with no gravity to hold her to anything solid. "You could have camped anywhere," she said. "Why here?" He looked past her toward the warm light spilling from a small kitchen, then back to her face. "Saw your lights from the ridge. Been walking in the dark for an hour, and I suppose even a man who's used to being alone sometimes craves a proof that is not the only soul left in the world." The honesty of it caught her off guard. She'd expected some story about needing shelter or directions, not this raw admission of loneliness that echoed her own. I've got a fire ring out by the old tank stand, she heard herself say, unlatching the screen door. You can build your fire there, but you stay out there, understand? I don't know you from Adam. His face broke into a smile that transformed him entirely, erasing years and worry lines. Wouldn't dream of imposing on the queen of this cold ranch, though I'd be grateful for the permission to build a fire that won't set half the outback ablaze. Queen of the cold ranch. Despite herself, Amelie felt her mouth twitch. It had been so long since anyone had teased her that she'd almost forgotten how. There's a tap near the tank if you need water, she said, stepping back into her doorway. And mind the wallabies. They are curious about strangers. I'll keep that in mind. He touched his fingers to his forehead in a small salute. Thank you, Amelie. She blinked. I didn't give you my name. No, but your mailbox did. Amelie Crawford. He shouldered his pack again. It's a beautiful name. Suits you. Before she could respond, he turned and walked into the gathering darkness, leaving her standing in her doorway with her heart doing things it hadn't done in years. She watched until she saw the first flicker of his fire bloom near the old tank, then shut the door firmly and leaned against it. Dangerous, she told herself. Men who show up out of nowhere asking philosophical questions about solitude and nothing but trouble. But as she moved through her evening routine, washing her cup, banking her own fire, checking the locks out of habit rather than fear, she found herself listening for sound from outside. The murmur of his voice, though she couldn't make out words. Was he talking to himself? Singing? The sound was comforting in a way that made her chest ache. She'd grown so accustomed to the night sounds of her property, the rustle of native grasses, the distant call of an owl, the creaking of old timber settling, that she'd forgotten how different it felt to know another human heart was beating nearby. Sleep, when it finally came, was restless. She woke twice to check the window, seeing the soft glow of his fire still burning in the distance like a small star fallen to earth. Morning came with a sharp clarity that only winter mornings possess, the air so crisp it seemed to ring like crystal when she stepped outside to check her water tanks. The smell of wood smoke drifted on the wind, and she could see Thomaz moving around his small camp, methodically packing his swag. She stood watching him longer than she should have, noting the efficiency of his movements, the way he'd left his fire ring clean and surrounded by stones. A considerate man, then one who understood the unwritten laws of the bush. Her feet carried her toward him before her mind could object. Morning, she called when she was close enough that he wouldn't think she was shouting. He looked up from rolling his sleeping bag, and again that smile transformed his face. Morning, Queen Amelie. Beautiful dawn, isn't it? She'd stopped correcting people about the queen business. Let him have his jokes. You're leaving early. Didn't want to overstay my welcome. Woman shows a stranger kindness. The least he can do is not become a burden. She found herself studying his camp more closely. He'd gathered kindling for his fire from dead wood only, hadn't disturbed so much as a blade of grass unnecessarily. Even his footprints seemed deliberately light. Where are you headed? The question emerged before she could stop it. He paused in his packing, looking out toward the horizon where the sun was painting the red earth gold. Honestly, I haven't decided. Maybe Alice Springs. Maybe Darwin. Maybe I'll just keep walking until something tells me to stop. There was something infinitely lonely in that, and Amelie felt an unexpected tug of sympathy. That's no way to live. Isn't it? He straightened, meeting her eyes. What's the alternative? Settling somewhere I don't belong, pretending I've got roots when all I've really got is the ability to keep moving. The words hit too close to home. Wasn't that exactly what she'd been doing here for 19 years? Pretending the Outback was home when really it was just a place she'd stopped running? I was married to a drover once, she said quietly. He used to say that some people are born to wander, and some are born to wait for the wanderers to come home. But he never said what happens when the wanderers never find what they're looking for. Thomaz was very still, watching her face. What happened to your drover? Fell off a horse and broke his neck when he was 34. The words came out matter-of-fact, the way they always did after 19 years of practice. Left me with 2 boys and a property that barely paid for itself. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was a long time ago. But even as she said it, she realized it didn't feel long ago. Not when she was looking into the eyes of another lost soul and remembering what it felt like to matter to someone. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning air crisp between them. Then Thomaz did something unexpected. He sat down on a fallen log near his extinguished fire and looked up at her. "Tell me about this place," he said. "How long have you been queen of the cold ranch?" Despite everything, she laughed, actually laughed, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine. 19 years. Though I think the title is self-appointed. The best titles usually are. His eyes crinkled at the corners. What keeps you here? The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. What did keep her here? Habit? Fear? The simple inability to imagine herself anywhere else? It's quiet, she said finally, and quiet means safe. He nodded as if that made perfect sense. Safe from what? From hoping for things that won't happen. From caring about people who'll leave. The honesty surprised her. She hadn't meant to say any of that. And from fires that might burn too bright, he asked gently. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. Understanding, maybe, recognition. The look of someone who'd built his own careful distance from hope and found it both necessary and hollow. Something like that, she whispered. The sun climbed higher, warming the air between them, and Thomaz made no move to shoulder his pack again. Instead, he asked about her cattle, her windmills, the small garden she kept behind the house. Questions that required real answers, that suggested genuine interest. And slowly, carefully, like a wild animal approaching a water source, Amelie found herself telling him things. About the year the drought nearly broke her. About her sons, grown now and living in Adelaide, who called on Sundays and visited at Christmas and worried about her in the abstract way children worry about parents they love but don't quite understand. About the neighbor who died 5 years ago, leaving her truly alone on this stretch of red earth. In return, he told her about the copper mine, about a crew of men who'd become temporary family before scattering to the winds when the ore ran out. About years spent moving from job to job, town to town, never quite belonging anywhere but never quite willing to stop looking for the place where he might. "Are you hungry?" she asked when the sun was high enough to start warming the day. He considered this. "I am. But more than that, I'm curious about what the queen of the cold ranch considers proper breakfast." "Eggs," she said, "and toast, and coffee strong enough to wake the ancestors." "That sounds perfect." She meant to tell him he could have breakfast and then be on his way. Meant to make it clear that one night's kindness didn't constitute an invitation to stay. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, "Well, come on then. Those eggs won't cook themselves." As she watched him bank his fire with the careful precision of a man who understood the deadly seriousness of fire in the bush, Amelie felt something shifting inside her chest. Something that had been frozen solid for 19 years was beginning to crack. Dangerous, she told herself again, but she was already walking toward the house, and he was following. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the morning felt full of possibility instead of just a promise of another day to get through. Behind them, the last wisps of smoke from his fire dissipated into the clear winter air, but the warmth it had generated seemed to linger, changing the very chemistry of the space between them. Neither of them knew it yet, but they'd already crossed a line from which there would be no easy return. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Ice. Breakfast stretched into morning coffee, which wandered into conversation about the weather, which somehow meandered into Thomaz helping her fix a loose board on the front steps. By the time the sun reached its zenith, his pack still sat where he'd left it by the old tank, and neither of them had mentioned his departure again. "You don't have to stay and help," Amelie said as she watched him examine the sagging fence line near her vegetable garden. "I've been managing alone for 19 years. "I'm sure you have." He tested the tension on a wire, frowning at the give in it. "But that doesn't mean you have to keep doing it alone if there's another option." She was quiet for a moment, watching his hands work. They were the hands of a man who'd spent his life working with tools and earth, scarred, capable, gentle when they needed to be. so different from Robert's hands, which had been smooth from handling stock and leather. Different, but equally competent. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. He straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "I'm suggesting that you've got about 2 days' worth of repairs that would be easier with 2 people. I'm suggesting that I got nowhere particular to be in reasonable skills with tools. And I'm suggesting that maybe we are both tired of pretending we don't enjoy the conversation." The directness of it took her breath away. When had she last had someone speak to her so plainly about wants and needs and simple human connection? And after 2 days, we see how we feel about it. He smiled, that transformative expression that seemed to light him from within. "I'm not asking you to marry me, Amelie. I'm asking if you'll let me fix your fence and maybe share another meal or 2. She should have said no, should have thanked him for the morning's help, and sent him on his way before whatever this was between them had a chance to take root. But standing there in the winter sunshine, watching the way the light caught the silver in his hair, she found herself nodding. 2 days, she said, but you sleep outside. Understood, Your Majesty. The fence repair took most of the afternoon, with Amelie holding post steady while Thomaz retensioned the wire. They worked mostly in companionable silence, occasionally commenting on the work or the weather, but Amelie found herself stealing glances at her unexpected helper. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd done this kind of work many times before, never rushing, never growing frustrated when a wire proved stubborn or a post needed repositioning. "You good at this," she said as he twisted wire around a corner post with practiced ease. "Should be. Spent 3 years working stations in Queensland before I got into mining." He paused, looking out over a small herd of cattle scattered across the paddock. "Good country here. Dry, but good bones." Robert always said the same thing. Said the Outback doesn't lie to you. It tells you exactly what it is, and it's up to you to decide if you can live with the truth of it. "Smart man, you're Robert." He was. She was surprised by how easily his name came now, how talking about him to Thomaz felt natural rather than painful. He would have liked you, I think. He had respect for men who could work with their hands. Thomaz finished the wire connection and moved to test the fence's stability. "Tell me about him." So she did, finding herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone in years. Robert's terrible sense of direction that somehow never mattered because he could read the land like a book. His habit of singing opera badly while he worked, claiming it kept the cattle calm. The way he'd insisted on dancing with her in their small kitchen every Sunday morning, no matter how much work waited outside. He sounded like he was larger than life, Thomaz said when she'd run out of stories. He was. That's what made his death so. She struggled for the word. Impossible. Men like Robert aren't supposed to die from something as ordinary as falling off a horse. They're supposed to go out in bushfires or floods, fighting something worthy of them. Thomaz set down his tools and looked at her with such understanding that her breath caught. "My Sarah died of cancer at 42, he said quietly. Took 11 months from diagnosis to burial. I kept thinking there had to be some mistake, some cosmic error. Women like Sarah, women who could coax roses to bloom in clay soil and convince wild birds to eat from their hands. They weren't supposed to just waste away in hospital beds." The revelation hung between them like a bridge, connecting their separate griefs into something shared and somehow more bearable. "Is that why you move around so much?" Amelie asked gently, "Because nowhere feels right without her." "Maybe. Or maybe I just never learned how to stay in one place long enough to put down roots." He picked up his tools again, but his movements were slower now, more thoughtful. Sarah was the one with the gift for making home wherever she was. Without her, I'm just a man with a swag and enough money saved to avoid making permanent decisions. They worked in silence after that, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the careful politeness of strangers, but the comfortable sharing of space between two people who'd revealed something real about themselves. When the fence was finished, Thomaz gathered the leftover wire and staples with the same methodical care he'd shown that morning breaking camp. Amelie found herself watching him, noting the way he seemed to approach every task as if it mattered, as if doing it well was a form of respect for the tools and materials and land involved. "Thank you," she said as they walked back toward the house, tools in hand. I've been looking at that fence for months, telling myself I'd get to it eventually. Sometimes it's easier to tackle things with company. She glanced at him sideways. Is that your philosophy on life? Everything's easier with company. Not everything, but the things that matter? Yeah, I think they usually are. That evening, she cooked dinner for two for the first time in 19 years, adding an extra chop to the pan and setting two places at a small kitchen table. It felt strange and natural all at once, the simple act of sharing a meal with another adult. They talked about books. She was surprised to learn he carried a worn copy of poetry in his pack, Banjo Paterson and Judith Wright, about places they'd been and wanted to see, about the small rebellions that had shaped their younger selves. I wanted to be a teacher, Amelie admitted over dessert, 10 peaches she'd opened to mark the occasion, had a scholarship to university and everything. But then I met Robert, and he was so alive, so sure of what he wanted. She shrugged. Sometimes you choose love over dreams, and sometimes you're lucky enough that they turn out to be the same thing. Were you? Lucky enough, I mean... She considered this. For 14 years. Yes, I never regretted choosing him over university. But after he died, I sometimes wondered who I might have been if I'd made different choices. And now I think maybe it's too late for wondering. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. Something about Thomaz's presence was making her question assumptions she'd carried for decades. When dinner was finished, he insisted on helping with the dishes, standing beside her at the sink with a tea towel while she washed. The domestic intimacy of it should have felt awkward, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Where will you sleep? She asked as they dried the last plate. Same place as last night, by the tank. He hung up the tea towel with care. Unless you've got a spare room you're not mentioning. She did, actually. Robert's old office, which had become a storage room after his death but could easily be cleared. But inviting him inside felt like crossing a line she wasn't ready to cross. The tank's fine, she said, but if it gets too cold. I've slept in worse places. He paused at the back door, looking back at her. Thank you for dinner, Amelie, and for letting a wanderer fix your fence. Thank you for fixing it. He nodded and stepped into the night, leaving her alone in her kitchen with two clean plates and the lingering scent of his aftershave, something simple and pine-scented that reminded her of the forest her father had taken her to as a child. That night, she lay in bed listening to the familiar night sounds of her property, but underneath them she could hear something new, the soft murmur of Thomaz's voice as he talked to himself beside his fire. Or maybe he was singing. The sound was too distant to make out words, but the rhythm of it was soothing, like a lullaby for the vast empty spaces of the Outback. For the first time in years, Amelie fell asleep smiling. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and something else. Coffee, strong and rich, drifting through a bedroom window on the morning breeze. When she dressed and stepped outside, she found Thomaz tending a small fire beside the house, a batacam pot suspended over the flames. Good morning, Your Majesty, he said, looking up with that smile that seemed to chase away the morning chill. I hope you don't mind. I thought I'd return the breakfast favor. You made coffee. Coffee and damper bread. Nothing fancy, but it'll fill the hollow spots. He gestured to where a flat loaf of bread was warming on a stone beside the fire. My grandmother's recipe, more or less. She used to make it when I was small, back when my parents still had hopes of settling down somewhere. Amelie accepted the cup he offered, inhaling the steam that rose from it. The coffee was exactly as promised, strong enough to wake the ancestors, with a richness that spoke of good beings treated with respect. Your parents moved around a lot. Every few years. Dad was a geologist, always chasing the next survey job or mining opportunity. Mom adapted as best she could, but I think she dreamed of a little house with a garden where she could plant flowers and know they'd bloom the same place next year. Did she ever get it? Eventually, a cottage in Ballarat with roses and a proper vegetable patch. But by then I was grown and gone, and I think she'd forgotten how to stay still. She died still talking about the places they might go next. There was a gentle sadness in the way he said it that Amelie felt her heart clench. Some people are born to wander. she said, echoing her own words from the day before. And some are born to wait for the wanderers to come home, he finished. But what happens when the wanderers learn to stop wandering? It was a question that hung between them like morning mist, full of possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Amelie sipped her coffee and watched the sun paint the horizon gold, aware that something fundamental was shifting in the space between them. Yesterday, she'd allowed a stranger to help with a fence. This morning, she was sharing coffee with a man who felt less like a stranger and more like, what? A friend? Something deeper that she wasn't ready to name? What needs doing today? Thomaz asked, breaking into her thoughts. She looked around her property with new eyes, seeing it as he might see it, a place that had been maintained by one person for too long, showing the subtle signs of deferred maintenance that accumulate like dust in the corners of a solitary life. The windmill's making noise, she said, and there's firewood to split, and I should check the water troughs in the far paddock. Sound like a full day. He stood, brushing dust from his jeans. Good thing you've got help. As they worked side by side through the morning, him climbing the windmill to oil the bearings while she held the ladder steady, both of them splitting wood with the easy rhythm of people who understood the value of physical labor. Amelie found herself cataloging small details about him, the way he hummed unconsciously while he worked, the careful respect he showed for her tools and property, the fact that he never assumed he knew better than she did about her own land, always asking questions rather than making suggestions. By midday, they'd accomplished more than she usually managed in a week working alone. But more than that, she'd enjoy the work in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. There was something deeply satisfying about shared labor, about the easy communication that developed between two people working toward a common goal. You're good company, she said as they sat in the shade of a porch, sharing lunch and cold beer. So are you. He tipped his bottle toward her in a small salute. I'd forgotten what it felt like to work alongside someone who actually cares about getting things done right. Most people don't. Mining crews care about getting things done fast. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment, looking out over her property with an expression she couldn't quite read. This is good land, Amelie. Good bones, like I said yesterday, but more than that. It's got peace, harmony, like someone's been taking care of it with love instead of just obligation. The compliment warmed her more than the midday sun. Robert and I, we always said the land would take care of us if we took care of it first. Smart philosophy. He finished his beer and set the bottle carefully beside his J. You've honored that bargain. They spent the afternoon checking water troughs and fences, walking the boundaries of a property while she pointed out landmarks and told him stories about the land's history. He listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested, asking questions that showed he understood both the practical and emotional significance of what she was sharing. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that only the Outback could achieve, they found themselves at the highest point on a property, a small rise that offered a view of the surrounding country for kilometers in every direction. Beautiful, Thomaz said quietly, and she wasn't sure if he meant the sunset or the land or something else entirely. It's home, she replied, and realized he meant it in a way she hadn't for years. Standing here with him, seeing her property through his eyes, it felt like home again instead of just a place where she existed. They walked back to the house in comfortable silence, and when they reached the kitchen, Amelie found herself reluctant to end the day. The evening stretched ahead, full of possibility and the kind of anticipation she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Would you like to stay for dinner again? She asked, trying to keep her voice casual. His smile was answer enough. I'd like that very much. That night, as she prepared their second shared meal, Amelie caught herself humming, actually humming, while she worked. It had been so long since music had spontaneously emerged from her that the sound of her own voice startled her. Outside, she could see Thomaz banking his fire for the evening, moving with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. Tomorrow would be his second full day here, the end of the agreement they'd made. But as she set two places at a table and opened a bottle of wine she'd been saving for no particular occasion, Amelie realized she was no longer thinking in terms of endings. For the first time in 19 years, She was thinking about beginnings. Chapter 3. Whispers and Winds. The phone call came on Thomaz's fifth morning at the station, shattering the peaceful routine they'd unconsciously established. Amelie was making breakfast while he tended his fire outside when the shrill ring cut through the morning air like a blade. She glanced through the kitchen window, catching Thomaz's questioning look, then wiped her hands on her apron and lifted the receiver. "Mom." Her eldest son's voice crackled through the static. "James here. How are you holding up out there?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." The endearment felt strange on her tongue after days of easy banter with Thomaz. "What's got you calling so early?" "Mrs. Patterson from town mentioned she saw smoke from your place the past few nights. More than usual. She was worried something might be wrong with your heating system." Amelie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of small-town observation settling around her shoulders like a familiar yoke. She should have expected this. Nothing happened in their corner of the Outback without someone noticing, and smoke signals traveled faster than gossip, which was saying something. "My heating's fine, James." "So what's with all the smoke?" She looked out the window again, watching Thomaz carefully bank his cooking fire. How to explain this? How to tell a worried son that she'd invited a stranger to camp on her property and found herself looking forward to his company more than she'd anticipated. "I have a guest," she said carefully. The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if the connection had dropped. Then, "A guest? Mom, what kind of guest?" "The human kind, James. A traveler who needed a place to rest for a few days." "A stranger?" His voice rose with concern. "Mom, you can't just. You don't know anything about him. He could be dangerous." "He's not dangerous." The certainty in her own voice surprised her. When had she become so sure? "How do you know? What's his name? Where is he from? What's he doing out there?" The questions came rapid fire, and Amelie felt herself bristling at the interrogation. At 53, being questioned about a judgment by a 30-year-old son felt both patronizing and painful. "His name is Thomaz. He's from the copper mine that closed last week, and is helping me with repairs around the station." Helping with repairs. James's voice carried the careful tone he might use with confused elderly relative. "Mom, you've never needed help before." "That doesn't mean I couldn't use it." Another pause. "I think I should drive up. Check on you. Meet this Thomaz." "James? No." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "I'm perfectly fine. Better than fine, actually. I don't need you to check on me like I'm some doddering old woman who can't be trusted to make her own decisions. That's not what It's exactly what you meant." She softened her voice with effort. "Sweetheart, I know you worry, but I've been managing this station and taking care of myself for 19 years. I think I can handle one middle-aged miner." She heard James sigh through the static. "It's just, you've been alone so long, Mom. Sometimes people who've been isolated can lose perspective about strangers." The words stung more than they should have. And sometimes people who live in the city forget that their mothers raised them to be independent, capable adults by being independent, capable women themselves. After James hung up, with promises to call again soon and thinly veiled threats to drive up unannounced if he didn't hear from her regularly, Amelie stood holding the dead receiver and feeling the intrusion of the outside world like a physical weight. "Everything all right?" She turned to find Thomaz in the doorway, concern creasing his features. How much had he overheard? "My son," she said, hanging up the phone. "Someone in town noticed your fires and decided to report back." Thomaz nodded slowly. Small towns have long memories and loud voices. "He wants to drive up and meet you. Make sure you're not some kind of dangerous drifter taking advantage of his poor, defenseless mother." "Are you? Defenseless? I mean..." Despite her frustration, Amelie found herself smiling. "What do you think?" "I think anyone who's managed to keep a station running solo for 19 years could probably handle one middle-aged miner without breaking a sweat." His expression grew more serious. "But I also think sons worry about their mothers, and maybe that's not entirely a bad thing, even when it's inconvenient." "You sound like you speak from experience." My mother worried about me right up until the day she died. Drove me half mad sometimes, but looking back," he shrugged, "at least someone cared where I was sleeping at night." The simple honesty of it deflated her anger like air from a punctured tire. Of course James was worried. She'd lived like a hermit for nearly 2 decades, and suddenly there was a stranger camping on her property. From his perspective, she supposed it might look concerning. "I told him you weren't dangerous," she said. "Good, because I'm not." Thomaz studied her face carefully. "But I am complicating your life, and I? Making people ask questions you'd rather not answer." Was he? She considered this as she moved back to the stove, automatically stirring the eggs she'd abandoned when the phone rang. The truth was, she hadn't given much thought to what people might think or say about Thomaz's presence. For 5 days, her world had shrunk to just the two of them and the work they shared and the easy companionship that had grown between them like something organic and inevitable. "I don't much care what people think," she said finally, "but you care what your son thinks." "I care that he worries." She dished the eggs onto 2 plates, adding toast and the grilled tomatoes Thomaz had brought from town on his supply run yesterday. "But I also care that I'm 53 years old and perfectly capable of deciding who I want to have breakfast with." They ate in thoughtful silence, the easy rhythm of their morning disrupted by the intrusion of outside judgment. Amelie found herself studying Thomaz as he ate, trying to see him through James's eyes. What would her son see? A weathered man with work-scarred hands and lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and wind. A drifter with no permanent address and few possessions beyond what he could carry. Someone whose presence in her life couldn't be easily explained or categorized. But what she saw was different. She saw someone who asked thoughtful questions and listened to the answers, who handled her property and possessions with respect, who worked beside her without trying to take over or assume he knew better, who made her laugh and made her remember that conversation could be a pleasure rather than just a necessity. "I should probably move on," Thomaz said quietly, not looking up from his plate. "Because my son is concerned about a stranger. Because your life was peaceful before I showed up asking to build fires on your land." The matter-of-fact way he said it made her chest tighten. Peaceful, yes, but peaceful and happy aren't the same thing. He looked up then, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Are you saying I make you happy?" The question hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or refuse to acknowledge. For a moment, the kitchen was silent except for the tick of the wall clock and the distant lowing of cattle. "I'm saying," she said carefully, "that I've laughed more in the past 5 days than I have in the past 5 years. I'm saying that I wake up looking forward to the day instead of just getting through it. I'm saying that if you leave because some busybody in town has opinions about smoke signals, I'll be angry about it for a very long time." Thomaz set down his fork and studied her face. "And if I stay, what then?" "Then we figure it out as we go." The words surprised her with their boldness. When had she become someone who improvised instead of planned? People will talk. People always talk. The question is whether we let them decide how we live our lives. He was quiet for a long moment, and she could almost see him weighing possibilities in his mind. Finally, he smiled, not the transformative grin she'd grown accustomed to, but something smaller and more tentative. "In that case," he said, "I think that windmill in the south paddock could use some attention. The blades aren't turning as freely as they should." Relief flooded through her so suddenly that she had to grip the edge of the table. "You notice that? Hard to miss when you know what to look for." He finished his breakfast and stood. Besides, someone has to keep the Queen of the Cold Ranch's equipment in working order. The day passed like the ones before it. Work and conversation and the growing ease of 2 people learning each other's rhythms. But underneath the familiar patterns, Amelie was aware of a new tension. Not the electric possibility that had characterized their first few days together, but something more complex. The weight of outside scrutiny. The knowledge that their small bubble of contentment existed in a larger world that had opinions about propriety and appropriate behavior for widows of a certain age. That evening, as they sat on a porch watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Thomaz brought up the subject they'd both been carefully avoiding. "Your son," he said. "Tell me about him." Amelie sipped her tea and considered how to explain James. He's a good man, works in Adelaide, manages a construction company, married to a lovely woman named Sarah. Yes, same name as your wife, with 2 young children I don't see nearly often enough. But he sees me as his responsibility instead of his mother. Ever since Robert died, he's carried this burden of worry about me that I never asked him to carry. She set down her cup. I know he loves me, but sometimes love can become its own kind of prison. What about your other son? David, 2 years younger, lives in Melbourne. He's an architect, travels constantly for work. He calls when he remembers, visits when guilt compels him, and generally treats me like a beloved but slightly inconvenient relative. She smiled ruefully. In some ways, his benign neglect is easier to handle than James's anxious hovering. Do you miss them? The question was simple, but the answer was laid with 19 years of complicated emotions. I miss the boys they used to be. I miss the time when we were all living here together and I was the center of their world instead of a worry item on their mental checklists. She paused. But I don't miss the chaos of raising teenagers, and I respect the men they become, even when they frustrate me. Thomaz nodded thoughtfully. It's hard, watching your children grow up and away from you. Sarah and I never had kids, but I watched it happen with my sister's family. One day, her boys needed her for everything, and the next they barely remembered to call on her birthday. The natural order of things, Amelie said, but that doesn't make it less lonely. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled around them, the Southern Cross emerging in the clear sky above. Somewhere in the distance, a dingo called, wild and mournful, and Amelie felt the sound echo in her chest. Amelie, Thomaz said quietly, what are we doing here? The question she'd been avoiding asking herself hung in the night air between them. What were they doing? She told herself he was just helping with repairs, that she was simply being neighborly to a traveler in need. But 5 days of shared meals and easy companionship, and growing awareness of him as a man rather than just a helpful stranger had made those explanations ring hollow. I don't know, she admitted, but I know I don't want it to stop. Even if it makes your life more complicated. Especially if it makes my life more complicated. The words surprised her with their vehemence. Do you know what my life has been like for 19 years? Thomaz? Simple, predictable, safe, and so empty that sometimes I forgot I was still breathing. He was very still beside her, and she could feel the weight of his attention like a physical presence. I wake up at the same time every day, she continued. I do the same chores in the same order. I eat the same meals and read the same books and go to bed at the same time every night. And for 19 years, I told myself that was enough, that safety and routine were what I wanted. And now I think safety and routine might just be other words for slow suffocation. Thomaz reached across the space between their chairs and touched her hand, the first physical contact they'd shared beyond the accidental brush of fingers when passing tools. His skin was warm and slightly rough from work, and the simple touch sent electricity shooting up her arm. I'm 50 years old, he said quietly. I've spent the last 8 years moving from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to unpack completely. I told myself I was being practical, avoiding complications, keeping things simple. And now I think maybe I was just avoiding the possibility of caring about something enough to risk losing it again. His thumb traced across her knuckles, a touch so gentle it made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. I care about you, he said, more than I expected to. More than is probably wise for two people who've known each other less than a week. Is that what this is? Caring? Among other things. His voice carried a warmth that made her pulse quicken. The question is what we want to do about it. Amelie thought about James's concern, about the gossip that was probably already making its way through town, about the complications that came with allowing someone into a life she'd spent 19 years carefully constructing around solitude. Then she thought about waking up this morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of Thomaz humming by his fire, about the way he listened when she talked, really listened, as if her thoughts and opinions mattered, about the way her house felt warmer and more alive with his presence nearby. I want to stop pretending this is temporary, she said. I want to stop acting like you're just a helpful stranger who'll be moving on any day now. And I want to stop sleeping by the tank when there's probably a more comfortable option available. The suggestion hung between them, loaded with possibility and implication. Amelie felt her cheeks warm despite the cool night air. There's Robert's old office, she said carefully. It's been used for storage, but it has a proper bed. That sounds perfect. They sat in silence for a while longer, hands linked across the space between their chairs, both of them aware that something fundamental had shifted in the space of a single conversation. Tomorrow, Thomaz would move his few possessions inside. Tomorrow, they would cross another line from which there might be no easy return. But tonight, Amelie felt more alive than she had in 19 years. Tonight, the Outback didn't feel like a place where she'd come to hide from the world. It felt like home, not just hers, but theirs. Later, as she prepared for bed while Thomaz settled his things in Robert's old office, Amelie caught sight of herself in the mirror above her dresser. The woman looking back had color in her cheeks and light in her eyes that had been missing for so long she'd forgotten what they looked like. Dangerous, she thought, but this time the word felt less like a warning and more like a promise. Outside her window, she could see the glow from Thomaz's fire, smaller tonight, since he wouldn't need it for warmth much longer, but still burning, casting its warm light into the darkness like a beacon for lost souls finding their way home. Chapter 4. The Second Sunrise. 3 weeks after Thomaz moved inside, Amelie woke before dawn to the sound of rain drumming against a bedroom window. The first real rain in months, arriving with the promise of spring and the kind of gentle insistence that made the earth sigh with relief. She lay listening to it for a while, aware of the warmth beside her in the bed, the steady rhythm of Thomaz's breathing, the way his arm curved around her waist as if holding her close was the most natural thing in the world. They'd grown into this intimacy slowly, carefully, like two people learning a new language together. The transition from him sleeping in Robert's office to sharing her bed had happened gradually. First a cup of tea shared in the kitchen at midnight when neither could sleep. Then quiet conversations that stretched into the small hours. Then the night when he'd fallen asleep on a couch while they talked and she covered him with a blanket rather than wake him. Finally, the evening when she'd simply taken his hand and led him to her room, both of them understanding that they'd moved beyond the need for separate spaces. It had been 19 years since she'd shared a bed with anyone, and she'd forgotten the simple comfort of another heartbeat in the darkness, the way two people could fit together like pieces of a puzzle they'd never known was incomplete. Listen to that, Thomaz murmured against his shoulder, his voice rough with sleep. The rain, the sound of your land drinking. His arm tightened around her. I can practically hear the grass celebrating. She smiled, nestling closer to his warmth. One of the things she discovered about Thomaz was his poet's way of seeing the world, the manner in which he found beauty and meaning in things most people took for granted. The cattle will be happy, she said. They've been eyeing the clouds hopefully for weeks. Smart cattle. They know when change is coming. There was something in the way he said it that made her turn to study his face in the dim light filtering through her curtains. What kind of change? He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing his words carefully. I had a call yesterday while you were checking the south fence, from a mate in Darwin. There's a mining operation starting up, good money, steady work for at least 2 years. Amelie felt her stomach drop, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. This was what she'd known would happen eventually, wasn't it? Thomaz was a miner, a man who'd spent years moving from job to job. She'd always known their time together had an expiration date. That sounds like a good opportunity. She managed. It would be, if I wanted it. He rolled onto his side to face her fully, but I found myself telling him I wasn't available. Why? Because I've discovered something here that I didn't know I was looking for. His hand traced the line of her cheek with infinite gentleness. Because I've fallen in love with a queen who rules over red earth and stubborn cattle and sunsets that make grown men weep. The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath with their unexpectedness. She'd felt herself falling for him over the past weeks, had seen the same awareness growing in his eyes, but hearing it said aloud made it real in a way that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Thomaz, I know it's complicated, he said quickly, as if afraid she might protest. I know I don't have much to offer except a willingness to work hard and a heart that's tired of wondering. I know your sons probably think I'm after your land or your money. She silenced him with a kiss, pouring 19 years of loneliness and weeks of growing joy into the connection between them. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. I love you too, she whispered. And you're right. It's complicated and probably foolish, and my son James will have opinions about it that he won't hesitate to share. But I don't care about any of that. You don't? I'm 53 years old, and I've been sleepwalking through life for nearly 2 decades. You woke me up, Thomaz. You made me remember what it feels like to be alive instead of just surviving. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the dust from a world and filling the air with the rich scent of wet earth. They made love slowly, tenderly, with the unhurried passion of people who'd found something worth savoring. Afterward, they lay tangled together listening to the storm and talking quietly about the future, not in grand terms, but in the small, practical details that made up a shared life. I'd like to expand the vegetable garden, Amelie said, tracing patterns on his chest with her fingertip. Maybe add some fruit trees. The rainfall's been better this year. I'd like that. I've always wanted to try my hand at growing things instead of just pulling them out of the ground. And the cottage, it could use some updating. A proper bathroom, maybe a second bedroom for when the boys visit. A workshop, Thomaz added, somewhere to fix things properly instead of making do with the kitchen table. They were building their future in words, she realized, creating something together that was more than the sum of their separate lives. When the rain finally stopped, they dressed and went outside to assess the gift the storm had left behind. The air was clean and cool, washed free of dust and filled with the green scent of growing things. Her paddocks, which had been brown and brittle just hours before, were already showing hints of new growth. Look, Thomaz said, pointing toward the eastern horizon where the sun was breaking through the last of the storm clouds. The light caught the moisture in the air, creating a rainbow that arced across the vast sky in perfect, impossible colors. Beautiful, Amelie breathed, like everything else about this place. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into his warmth. Like you. They stood there together, watching the rainbow fade as the sun climbed higher, and Amelie felt something she hadn't experienced in 19 years. The deep, settled contentment of being exactly where she belonged with exactly the person she was meant to be there with. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke the spell, and they turned to see a familiar red truck bouncing down her access road, dust plume trailing behind it like a banner. James, Amelie sighed. Your son? My son. She squared her shoulders. He said he was going to drive up and check on me. I guess the day's a day. Thomaz's arms tightened around her briefly before he released her. How do you want to handle this? Honestly, she said, surprising herself with a certainty in her voice. I'm done hiding what makes me happy because someone else might not approve. The truck pulled up beside the house, and James climbed out, tall and lean like his father, but with worry lines around his eyes that Robert had never carried. He was followed by a woman Amelie didn't immediately recognize, blonde and carefully dressed despite the early hour and remote location. Mom, James said, his eyes already moving between Amelie and Thomaz with the kind of suspicious assessment she'd expected. You look well. I am well, James. Better than I've been in years. She kept her voice steady and welcoming. Who's your friend? This is Dr. Patricia Webb. She's a social worker who specializes in situations involving isolated seniors. The words hit Amelie like a slap. Situations. James was concerned about your judgment. Dr. Webb said smoothly, her voice carrying the practiced compassion of someone who dealt with difficult families regularly. When elderly people have been isolated for long periods, they can sometimes make decisions that aren't in their best interests. Elderly people, Amelie repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. Mom, we just want to make sure you're safe, James said quickly. That this man isn't taking advantage of you in some way. Thomaz stepped forward, and Amelie felt his calm presence beside her like an anchor. Perhaps we should all go inside and discuss this properly, he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of managing difficult situations. I'm Thomaz Kellner, by the way. He extended his hand to James, who hesitated before shaking it briefly. Dr. Webb made no move to shake hands at all, instead studying Thomaz with a clinical assessment of someone evaluating a potential threat. Inside, Amelie set the kettle on while the others arranged themselves around a small kitchen table with the careful politeness of adversaries observing a ceasefire. Dr. Webb pulled out a leather-bound notepad and began making notes, which somehow made everything feel more ominous. James, Amelie said as she prepared tea, I understand you're worried, but bringing a social worker to evaluate my mental competence is insulting and unnecessary. Is it? James leaned forward. Mom, 6 weeks ago you were living alone like you have for 19 years. Now there's a strange man living in your house, and according to Mrs. Patterson, you've been seen in town together acting like what, James? He flushed. Like a couple. Like you're involved with him. We are involved, Amelie said calmly, setting cups of tea in front of everyone. We are in love, actually. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Webb's stylus moved quickly across a tablet. James stared at his mother as if she'd announced plans to join the circus. Mom, he said finally, you barely know him. I know him well enough to know that he's kind and hard-working and treats me with respect, Amelie replied. I know that he makes me laugh and that I enjoy his company more than I've enjoyed anyone's in years. I know that for the first time since your father died, I'm looking forward to the future instead of just enduring the present. But he could be anyone, James protested. He could be after your money, your land. Your mother's financial situation is hardly attractive to a fortune hunter, Thomaz said quietly. The station barely breaks even most years, and there's more debt than assets. Anyone can see that from the books. You've looked at her books. Dr. Webb asked sharply. She showed them to me when we were discussing repairs and improvements. I have saving from 8 years of mining work, and I offer to invest in upgrades to the property. Thomaz's voice remained calm despite the obvious hostility in the room. Hardly the behavior of someone trying to take advantage. Amelie looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw the genuine fear beneath his anger and suspicion. He was terrified of losing her, she realized. Terrified that the stranger would hurt her or abandon her or somehow diminish the careful equilibrium they'd maintained for 19 years. James, she said gently, sweetheart, I know this is hard for you to understand, but I need you to trust that I'm still the same woman who raised you to be the good man you are. I need you to trust that I'm capable of making my own decisions about my own life. But what if you're wrong about him? James's voice cracked slightly, revealing the scared boy beneath the concerned adult. What if he leaves? What if he hurts you? Amelie felt Thomaz tense beside her, and she reached under the table to take his hand, lacing their fingers together in full view of their audience. What if he doesn't? She said. What if I found something real and precious and worthy of risk? What if the alternative, staying safe and alone and slowly dying of loneliness, is worse than any potential heartbreak? Dr. Webb cleared her throat. Mrs. Crawford, I have to ask some standard questions to assess your mental state and decision-making capacity. Ask away, Amelie said, her voice hardening. But understand that I'm answering under protest, and only because I want to demonstrate to my son that I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. The questions that followed were insulting in their simplicity. What year was it? Who was the Prime Minister? Could she count backward from 100 by sevens? Amelie answered each one with icy precision, her anger growing with each query designed to evaluate whether she was competent to make her own choices. Can you tell me about your daily routine? Dr. Webb asked. I wake at sunrise, check my cattle and water systems, maintain my property, prepare meals, read in the evenings, and go to bed at a reasonable hour, Amelie replied. With Thomaz here, I also enjoy conversation, shared meals, and the kind of companionship I'd forgotten was possible. And your financial situation? Stable but not prosperous. The station provides enough income to cover expenses, with small amounts left over for maintenance and emergencies. I have modest savings and no debt beyond the normal operating costs of running cattle. Any concerns about Mr. Kellner's access to your finances? Amelie's temper finally snapped. My concerns about finances involve whether we can afford to upgrade the solar system and put in a proper septic tank. I'm worried about cattle prices and rainfall, and whether the windmill in the South Paddock will make it through another summer. I am not worried about Thomaz taking advantage of me financially or otherwise, because I'm a grown woman with 19 years of experience managing my own affairs. She stood abruptly, moving to stand behind Thomaz's chair with her hands on his shoulders. Dr. Webb, you can put in your report that I am mentally competent, financially stable, and making informed decisions about my personal life. James, you can either accept that I found happiness with a good man, or you can continue to treat me like an incompetent child and damage our relationship permanently. But either way, Thomaz is staying, and so am I. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of Dr. Webb's stylus and the tick of the wall clock. Finally, Thomaz spoke into the tension. James, he said, looking directly at Amelie's son, I understand your concern for your mother. If I had a parent living alone in a remote area, I'd probably react the same way to news of a stranger in their life. James said nothing, but his posture suggested he was listening. I can't prove my intentions to you in the span of one conversation, Thomaz continued, but I can tell you that your mother is the strongest, most capable woman I've ever met. She doesn't need me to take care of her. She's been taking care of herself in this land quite successfully for years. What I offer is companionship, shared labor, and love. In return, she's given me the first real home I've known since my wife died. He reached up to cover Amelie's hands with his own. I'm not trying to replace your father or compete with your relationship with her. I'm just a man who's grateful to have found love a second time and determined not to waste it. The sincerity in his voice seemed to reach something in James, who looked back and forth between his mother and a lover with dawning understanding. You really love him, he said to Amelie, and it wasn't a question. I really do. And you're happy. Happier than I've been since your father died. James was quiet for a long moment, then sighed deeply. I'm sorry, Mum. I was scared, and I handled it badly. You were trying to protect me, Amelie said, moving around the table to hug her son. That comes from love, even when it's misguided. Dr. Webb closed her tablet with a sharp click. Mrs. Crawford clearly demonstrates full mental capacity and decision-making ability, she said crisply. I'll file a report stating that no intervention is necessary or warranted. After the social worker left and James had spent another hour getting to know Thomaz, asking pointed questions about his background and intentions that gradually softened into genuine conversation, Amelie found herself alone with her son on the porch while Thomaz tactfully made himself busy with afternoon chores. He seems like a good man, James said quietly. He is. And you're really happy. Really. She took his hand, noting how much it resembled his father's. James, I know this is hard for you to understand, but I'm not the same person I was when your father died. That woman needed protection and careful handling. This woman needs freedom and trust and the chance to make her own mistakes. What if he leaves? Then I'll be heartbroken for a while, and then I'll pick up and go on, because that's what people do. She squeezed his hand. But what if he stays? What if we build something beautiful together? Isn't that possibility worth the risk? James was quiet for a moment, watching Thomaz repair a section of fence with the same careful attention he brought to everything. I suppose it is, he said finally. And if it makes you this happy, well, maybe I've been worrying about the wrong things. That evening, after James had driven back to Adelaide with promises to visit again soon and to bring his family for a proper introduction, Amelie and Thomaz sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. The air still carried the clean scent of rain, and the sound of water running in the gutters was like music. Thank you, Amelie said. For what? For staying. For fighting for us. For not letting my son's fears chase you away. Thomaz turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw all the love and certainty she could ever need. "Where else would I go?" he said simply. "This is home now. Your home." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled around them, the Southern Cross emerging in the clear sky overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called, mild and free, and Amelie felt the sound echo in her chest like an answer to a question she'd been asking for 19 years. Later, as they prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror above her dresser. The woman looking back at her had silver threading through her hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of sun and wind and the passage of time. But she also had color in her cheeks and light in her eyes and the subtle glow of someone who was deeply, completely loved. Not dangerous, she thought. Transformative. Outside their bedroom window, the land stretched away into darkness, red earth, an endless sky, and a kind of silence that held infinite possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations with the sons, new adjustments to a life that suddenly included 2 heartbeats instead of 1. But tonight, for the first time in 19 years, Amelie Crawford fell asleep without wondering what she was surviving for. Tonight, she fell asleep knowing exactly why she was alive. The Outback had taken much from her over the years: isolation and hardship, the slow erosion of dreams deferred and hopes abandoned. But it had also given back, in its own mysterious way. It had given her solitude when she needed to heal, silence when she needed to think, and eventually, when she was finally ready, it had given her love. Second chances, she'd learned, didn't announce themselves with fanfare. They arrived quietly, sometimes in the form of a stranger asking permission to build a fire, sometimes in the space between one heartbeat, and the next when you finally understood that it was never too late to begin again. As she settled into Thomaz's arms, listening to his breathing slow into sleep, Amelie smiled into the darkness. Tomorrow, the sun would rise on a new day, a new season, a new chapter of a life she thought was finished but had discovered was just beginning. The queen of the cold ranch had found her king, and together they would rule over red earth and endless skies and all the beautiful, impossible possibilities that lay waiting in the space between what was and what could be. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of Amelie and Thomaz's story, though really, it's just the beginning of their new life together. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories start not with passion and fire, but with quiet recognition. 2 souls who weathered their own storms finding shelter in each other. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in second chances and the possibility that it's never too late to start over, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Your support helps us bring more stories like this one to life. And in the comments below, I'd love to hear from you. Have you experienced love after 50? Do you believe in second chances? Are you watching from your own piece of beautiful, empty country, or from a bustling city where stories like this one feel like dreams? Wherever you are, whatever season of life you're walking through, remember that your story isn't over. Sometimes the best chapters are still waiting to be written. Thank you for sharing this journey with Amelie and Thomaz. Until our next story, keep believing in the magic of unexpected beginnings and the transformative power of love that arrives exactly when you need it most.